Hey everybody, welcome back again to my spoiler-free absolute beginner's guide for Dark Souls Remastered. And after watching this, if there's something else you fancy learning, please check out my playlist. I should have every topic covered. This episode we're going to be looking at combat, all things offense. We'll be looking at defense in the next episode. Let's jump straight in. Alright, so let's get into this. Before we start, just remember a couple of things. Try your best not to spam your inputs. That input buffer will punish you if you do. And manage that stamina, because if you get caught short, it will not end well. Familiarise yourself with your weapon's movesets, both one- and two-handed. Some of the attacks will have utility that isn't really obvious at first. Bear in mind, each attack you can do with your weapon will consume a different amount of stamina. Oh, and there's something I totally forgot that I've had to add in at the very end of editing this episode. I'm sure you can work out how most of the weapons work for yourself, but there's some tricky parts to the axes and other sort of strike weapons that's worth pointing out. It does say this in the descriptions, but if you miss an attack with these weapons, your character will do like a stumble animation. It leaves you vulnerable. Additionally, you have to make sure that you hit with the tip of the weapon to do proper damage. If you end up hitting with the pole rather than the blade at the end of an axe, you will do reduced damage. You can work this out by sort of just looking at the damage numbers and things like that, but I thought it was worth pointing out because it's pretty obscure. Try and think about lock-on as a tool, not a requirement. In some cases it's better to use lock-on, but in others it could be better to not. For example, you might want to manually aim a heavy weapon like a greatsword. Or while locked on, you might have trouble with the camera. So disengaging the lock-on will enable you to move the camera and get an idea of what's going on. If you hit a wall, your weapon will bounce or deflect from it. And this will mean not only do you miss your attack, but you'll get stuck in like a recoil animation and be totally defenseless. So try and keep your surroundings in mind and use things like vertical or thrusting attacks when you're in narrow spaces. Poise is our resistance to flinching or reacting to enemy attacks. Think of it like another resource bar, like your stamina. If you take enough damage for it to reach 0, that's when you will do a stun animation and you'll be vulnerable to follow-up attacks. You don't need to have high poise to get through the game, but it can be really useful if you're the kind of person who wants to use big, slow weapons, because you can soak up damage without your attacks being interrupted. Worth noting that poise also affects enemies. So the heavier armor they have, the more damage you'll have to inflict in order to interrupt or stun them. Stronger attacks like your heavy attack button, two-handed attacks, they reduce poise by a greater amount. And similar to that, using the larger weapons will break poise quicker. There are 4 physical damage types in the game, which we can see on the stat screens. And each weapon lists its attack types at the top of the weapon details screen. So we have regular damage, slash damage, which comes from things like katanas and curved swords, strike damage, which is blunt weapons like maces, and thrust damage, which is like stabbing or poking. Weapons can do multiple damage types, but they will be tied to specific moves. So if we look at this S-stock, we can see that our light attack is a thrust attack, and the heavy attack counts as a regular attack. All enemies in the game will have strengths and weaknesses to certain damage types, so experiment and see. For elemental damage, we've got fire, lightning and magic. These will either be inherent in weapons that you find in the game, or will be available to you eventually when you're upgrading weapons. Magic damage scales with the intelligence stat. Fire and lightning damage don't scale at all. There are 2 more sort of special elemental types, divine and occult. They are special damage types that do extra damage to very specific enemies. These will scale with the faith stat, and they function just like magic damage otherwise. And as we said with the physical damage, certain types of enemies will have particular elemental weaknesses, so experiment and see what you find. If we stand close behind an opponent and press the light attack button, we will land a backstab. These attacks do massive damage, which will vary depending on what kind of weapon it is and the weapon's critical modifier. It can be tricky to find the correct spot if enemies are mid-animation, as sometimes the animations don't quite match up where the game thinks their back is. So when we block with our shield, we'll lose stamina. Once all of our stamina is depleted, our guard will be broken, we can't move, and we're left open to follow-up attacks. The thing is, enemies with shields behave the same way too. So just like you, if you reduce their stamina to 0, you'll break their guard. Heavy attacks or two-handed attacks or using large weapons are the most effective ways to break someone's guard. That kick move we learned back in the tutorial, that will deliver an instant guard break against an enemy holding a shield. It is super useful. A small build-up bar will show in the middle of the screen when you're being hit by a status effect. Once the bar reaches the top, the effect will trigger. So there are a few different effects in the game. We've got Poison, which is like a slow tick damage over time, Toxic, which is a faster, stronger version of Poison, and Bleed. Bleed is quite interesting. Once it's triggered, the target will lose a percentage of their HP. This percentage is based on the Bleed stat shown on the item description. Most Bleed weapons will cause 30% of health damage, but there are a few that have a higher value. All of these status effects we've just talked about can affect the player and the enemies in the game. But there is one more, Curse. Now this is a properly mean status effect. If the bar fills up, you'll instantly die. Oh, and yeah, so be careful. And unfortunately, only enemies have the power to cause Curse. Be strong out there, don't you dare go hollow. So there we are, combat in Dark Souls, although it seems quite simple in some respects, it's actually quite deep and nuanced. Very satisfying. I hope you enjoy it. Next time we're going to be looking at defensive options, so we're going to look at how shields work, rolling, parrying, all that good stuff. Cheers guys, thank you for watching. I'll catch you next time.